So up next we have a little change in the way we've been doing things. Dr. Candace Croney is here with us, but she's going to be speaking to us over the phone. There were some mechanical difficulties with the plane yesterday. But I would like to give her a brief introduction to let you know a little bit about her. And I met Dr. Croney when she was a postdoc working in the same lab that I worked in as a graduate student at the University of Maryland, and I was lucky enough to get involved with some of the cognition work that she was doing with some pigs at that time. So I learned a lot from her, and I'm sorry, Candace, I'm pulling up the bio. So she currently is an associate professor of animal behavior and well-being in the Animal Sciences Department at Purdue University. Her research, teaching, and extension efforts focus on the interactions between animal behavior, cognition, and well-being, the effects of rearing environments and enrichment on animal behavior and welfare, the ethical implications of animal care and use decisions, and public perceptions of animal agriculture. And her research on farm animal cognition has been featured in national and international broadcast programs by National Geographic, the BBC, and their affiliates. And she currently serves as scientific advisors on various animal welfare groups, such as the American Humane Association, the National Pork Board, and the National Pork Producers Council. And with that, I'm going to let Candace start, and I'll be running the slides, so it's sort of a circus, but thank you, Candace.
Yep. Christina, can you hear me?
I can.
Perfect. I'll just let you know when to advance the slides. I'll just tell you to go to the next point or the next slide, okay?
Okay.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm really sorry I could not be there. Our pilot is apparently a weenie and thought that brakes were important to land the plane or something like that. So I'm really sorry I couldn't be with you in person, but I'm delighted I can at least join you by phone. I'm really happy to talk to you about social housing in pigs, particularly in research settings. It is a very important consideration, and so Christina will go to the next slide.
Okay.
What I plan to cover for you is just touch a little bit on the importance of pigs as a biomedical model, talk about the ethical and really the scientific need for socially housing these animals in order to promote their well-being, and also to really enhance the validity of the research that we're conducting using them as subjects. I'll spend most of my time on really what constitutes social housing, especially in this species, and then move on to the specific considerations that are important when we think about social housing of pigs. Okay? Next slide, Christina.
Okay.
So the pig is clearly a popular animal model, particularly in biomedical research. Obviously, the reason for this is the number of physiological and anatomical similarities they have to humans. But as you're well aware, there's quite a bit of societal pressure to move away from using animal models in general, and certainly pressure to move away from using certain species, such as non-human primates and even dogs. So the pig has actually been used more and more frequently, and it's very interesting that when I did my dissertation research in 1999, I had this exact next line in my thesis presentation, which says that there's minimal literature on the welfare needs of pigs in biomedical research. That is as true today as it was in 1999. Unfortunately, there's even less published on the social housing needs of pigs. So when Christina asked me to do this talk, I was delighted and then wondered what I had done to really irritate her, because clearly there's no literature that I could easily go to. Okay, so I really had to do a lot of pulling, and so what you'll hear today is really a compilation of a number of different studies, and also based a lot on the work I and several of my colleagues are doing with these animals. Fortunately, we've actually had quite a lot of experience working not just on farms using these animals as our models, but also in laboratory research as well. It is really important to incorporate normal social behavior in any research model that involves maintenance of the animals over time. This is just as important in the pig, and in fact, doing this allows us to better meet our ethical obligations to their well-being as a function of deciding that it's appropriate to use them. The other issue is, and we'll get into some of the details of this a little bit later, is the accuracy and potentially the validity of the data that we're conducting is much more rigorous and trustworthy if we're really comprehensively ensuring that the welfare needs of the animals are met in all domains, in the physiological aspects, as well as the behavioral and the psychological components of well-being. Next slide, Christina.
Okay.
So a little bit on the isolation and stress and how this applies to pigs. Oftentimes for biomedical research purposes, as well as for other types of research, pigs are often isolated. Okay? This is well documented to cause behavioral as well as physiological signs of distress. And so providing some form of social support potentially provides a way to buffer these sorts of responses. Click again, Christina. One of the things we know is when we provide this kind of intervention, we tend to see decreased activation of the HPA axis following exposure to any sort of stressor. Next point. A number of different metrics of this have been well documented over time. We've seen reduced CRH release. Next point. Reduced ACTH release. Next point. Reduced glucocorticoid levels. All of these, of course, mediated through the HPA axis. Next slide, Christina. So the question becomes, yes, we've got some data that suggests that in general social support is important, but does social housing really matter to the pig? And obviously, if we're going to answer this question, one of the things we really need to look at is the ethology of the pig and what it tells us in regards to this question, and then also how to implement things. Next slide. If you look at the ethology of the pig, one of the bases for making any of the decisions of the animals that we're working with is oftentimes to look at what feral pigs do, what wild species of pigs do when left to their own devices. So in regards to normal social organization in the pig, what is typical is to have stable female groupings. What we'll often observe are several sows and piglets living together in groups, usually fairly harmoniously. We'll also see herds of young, what's referred to as bachelor boars, who will live together, and then you will oftentimes also see solitary older boars who may live in the vicinity, establish a territory, and then both the young group living boars and the solitary older boars will tend to join the female groups during the breeding season. We also know that there are key behaviors that are observed in virtually all pigs, including those that are bred for research, which suggests that they are important aspects of the pig's ethogram. And these include rooting behaviors, exploring, and most important to what we're going to talk about today, establishing social groups and hierarchies. Next slide. It is pretty clear and very well known that it's really undesirable to mix unfamiliar pigs. If that's done, and it needs to be minimized, we know what happens is pigs will absolutely get into fights, depending on the age, the experience, the breed, a number of different factors. The severity of the fighting is going to vary, but we know that that will typically occur over a 24 to 48-hour period until the dominance hierarchy is established. However, once that hierarchy is set, aggression is pretty infrequent. What is more common to see are affiliative behaviors, where what you'll oftentimes see are pigs making a lot of tactile contact with each other. They will group together, lie together, nuzzle each other, and you see lots of social facilitation, including learning from each other, new behaviors, foraging behaviors, exploratory behaviors, and so on. Next slide. We also know that pigs are highly motivated for social contact with each other. Next point. They have been demonstrated in numerous studies. I've just cited one for you here, where they will work for access to a companion by using different operant means. Next slide. Next point, sorry. When singly housed, they will oftentimes seek out some type of conspecific contact. So if they are allowed to have some kind of fence line contact, you will oftentimes, when they're resting, find them lying against each other or against that enclosure, so they're getting at least some level of tactile interaction. Next point. Some studies have shown that they will actually choose feed and social contact over bedding. When I'm done with this talk, I'll show you some more data that supports this finding. Next point. And we know that isolated pigs will show a chronic stress response compared to group-housed pigs. Next point. So collectively, just a small amount of data would suggest that social housing is indeed important to the pig, and clearly then, once we know that, ought to be important to our considerations of how we house these animals for research purposes. Next slide. We do know that something about the cognitive abilities of these animals is going to interact with their social behavior and cumulatively add up to tell us something about what's important in regards to their well-being. Next point. Several studies have demonstrated that pigs are fairly cognitively complex. They are behaviorally flexible and adaptable, and among the things that we know that are going to become relevant to how we interact with, manage, and house them are the idea that they absolutely have memory. They have memory for a number of different items, objects, events, and so on. They can absolutely do discrimination learning, so they can distinguish between companions. They can distinguish between odors, visual stimuli, and also location cues. And they are absolutely able to form concepts. And a lot of the work that has been done with this stuff has occurred in Europe. But we were fortunate in my group to do some of the earliest work in pig cognition. So the picture you see of the pig working on a computer task is actually work that I did in my dissertation research. Next point, Christina. Collectively, the information that we have on pig cognitive abilities suggests that they have the capacity to both learn and, more importantly, remember negative as well as positive experiences in the settings they find themselves. So this, of course, would apply to laboratory settings. And thus, the potential exists for them to either suffer and behave accordingly, or to cope well and behave accordingly in the settings in which they find themselves. Next point. As such, it's likely that they need and potentially benefit from support for their behavioral and psychological well-being, and that includes interventions that promote their social support. Next slide. We do have some evidence that stress buffering does occur in pigs, but that it's really important that you consider the familiarity of the companion animal that is provided to do this kind of buffering. We know that there are negative physiological and behavioral effects that are induced by social aggression, and we also know that these actually can be mitigated if the animal that has had that experience is subsequently housed with a familiar penmate. Okay? A number of other studies also show that when you provide familiar penmates as conspecifics or companions in conjunction with enrichment, so for instance, several of the studies I cited here looked at in young piglets providing a simulated udder. What we see is decreased distress behavior in early piglets that are weaned at a certain stage of time for experimental reasons. Next slide. So again, I think we've given a lot of evidence that social housing of pigs may be a very important consideration. So the question becomes, when we're making decisions relative to their housing or trying to implement social housing, what factors do we really need to consider? Next slide. And one of the first questions that we should be asking is, what constitutes social housing in pigs, right? Is it conspecific housing? Is it actually having the ability to interact with animals of the same species? A point that's not on here is just being housed in the presence of other animals sufficient to support the social needs of these animals? And then we also have to look at other alternatives. Our social interactions with animals of a different species, such as human-animal interactions, would they suffice? Are interactions with other species, for instance, other prey species, other farm animal species, sufficient? And so one of the things we need to consider, and this relates nicely back to the talk we previously heard, do pigs actually look at humans as potential conspecifics, or can human interactions at least fill in as a substitute if we can't provide social interactions with members of their own species? And then the last bit, and I will spend just a little bit of time on this, is are there other sort of inanimate forms of social support that are useful, viable, and salient for the pigs in the types of settings they may find themselves in for research purposes? Next slide, Christina. Clearly, if we're going to talk about conspecific housing considerations, we have to think about what the risks are. Next bullet point. And there are several when it comes to pigs. The first one, based on what I've already told you, should be thinking about how you introduce pigs so as to minimize aggressive interactions, which we know will occur within the first couple days. And how do you manage that when and if it does occur? Because it actually will occur. Okay? We have to consider this not just because there are risks to the equipment that we might be using. So for instance, if you have catheterized animals, you certainly don't want them ripping catheters out, but there's severe risk potentially to the animals themselves, which is actually the more important consideration in regard to their well-being. Now, of course, this interacts because pigs that are being treated for different purposes, if they're getting into fights with each other and have equipment attached to them, or have, for instance, depending on the type of research being done, any sort of wounded area or vulnerable area, you absolutely want to consider that to make sure the animals are protected. Next bullet point. Another factor to think about is the stability of the groups. Okay, so clearly, again, making sure that not only are introductions done well, but that once a group is set, even if that group is as small as a dyad, it stays stable unless there's really good reason to disrupt it, absolutely has to be a factor. Next bullet point. The other question, and I know there was actually a question already posed in advance about the size of pen mates. So there's a number of different points of research that will point to the idea that actually, if, for instance, you have, let's say, a smallest group you could get is a dyad. If, for instance, you have disparate pair sizes, what you'll oftentimes see is reduced or less severe aggression. Pigs typically will tend to suss each other up, get into fights, and oftentimes avoid fights or avoid longer fights or prolonged repeated fights as a function simply of the size of the animal they're engaged with. Okay? And so, although it is really uncommon to see this in both farm animal research settings and particularly less so in biomedical research settings, because we oftentimes want to have consistency in the size of animals that we're getting in, if it is at all possible, if you pair animals that are clearly different in terms of their weights, you will oftentimes have an easier time establishing the social hierarchy, maintaining it, and avoiding future aggressive encounters. One of the things we know is that pigs of uneven size and weights will also establish their social ranks much more quickly than if they're evenly matched. Next slide. Okay. Other factors that we need to consider are what else is in the pen with the animals. So it's not just that they're in there with each other, but what else is in there. And once you socially house these animals, any form of resource becomes potentially a point around which aggressive encounters can occur. First bullet point. So in group housing, we absolutely have to take care to avoid that, and any of the resources can become important, food, water, as well as enrichment. And I will tell you from a cognitive study that we're doing right now, we have our animals pair housed, and while people are typically careful about not having inappropriate competition around food and even thinking about enrichment, water can become a very clear resource that can run us into problems as well. So we have observed just very recently that when it's quite warm in some of the rooms that we're in, some of our pigs are using their operant waterers to create a little wallowing area. These become a point of contention as well, not something that we really anticipated and probably should have. Next bullet point. If resources are provided, as they have to be, we have to make sure that there is enough of them. Next bullet point. But it's not enough to just make sure that they've got enough of the resources. It's important to think about how these are dispersed throughout the space that they have. So with the pig, we know it's important that they have adequate feeder space. In a laboratory setting, it's important that you think about how many feeding stations are provided to the pigs, and also how closely they are set out next to each other if you've got multiple feeding stations. In some animals, or in some pairs, or some groups, individual feeding may absolutely be necessary, because oftentimes you will have an animal that is going to protect the most important resource and consistently do it and ensure that other animals don't have access to it. So we oftentimes will see, this is very common in sows, for instance, that are limit fed, but you absolutely can see this in pigs in other stages of life. If there is limit feeding, one of the problems that you can have happen is one animal literally blocks access or disrupts other animals consistently as they're trying to access that resource. If this happens, one of the things to think about, if it's pair housing, is potentially splitting up that pair and then allowing them to have fence line or pen line access to each other, again, to provide social support, because unless you really want to go into rehoming with another animal, which is going to result in aggression until that hierarchy is established again, there are a number of different ways and different reasons to not necessarily do that. Okay? But individual feeding may absolutely be necessary. So temporary removal for feeding may have to be done. In other instances, what may have to happen is that the animals are fed in the same area depending on the size of the enclosure, and just monitored while they are eating so that the one animal does not commandeer feed away from the other. If it's a group housing scenario, the problem animal really is the one that ought to be removed from the group. Next bullet point. In regards to interaction with enrichment in a group housing scenario, one of the things to think about is what type of enrichment you're giving. In the picture that I've given you here, where we've got these Panopinto micropigs are interacting with ball, we definitely want to think about not giving the sort of enrichment that can be commandeered. Okay? And so this is where having multiple forms of enrichment, so not just a single toy, but multiple toys, as well as other features of the environment that they can interact with, becomes important to really provide good social support. Whenever possible, providing for pigs enrichment that allows cooperative use should really be encouraged. So for instance, in our both farm settings and laboratory research settings, we will oftentimes hang toys so that they actually don't get dirty. And if I'm giving them a chew toy that is suspended by a hook, I will absolutely give them two so that if they're tugging on it, they can tug against each other, and we will alternate out or rotate out which types of toys they're given. That way, if there is competition, it's a useful dispersal of resources in regards to the energy they're expending against each other. It also becomes a nice way for the animals to redirect frustrated oral behaviors, which we oftentimes will see in pigs, especially if they're limit fed and are anticipating feeding around normal feeding times. Next slide, Christina. In regards to managing aggressive behavior in these animals, I'm just going to give you an older slide. This is actually a slide done by my PhD advisor. And one of the things they looked at is the effect of providing a simple hide area for pigs to tuck their heads into when they're engaging in aggressive interactions. If you look at the picture, what you will see is a nice little spotted pig off to the side is doing what's referred to as a flank attack towards the pig that he's engaged in. One of the things we know is when these interactions go on, simply allowing pigs to stick their heads and parts of their shoulders into a protected area so that they can turn off that direct eye contact and protect the parts of the body that their conspecifics will tend to go after will reduce aggression. It will certainly reduce the duration of attack in those animals that can occur, especially after they're regrouped. Now, this may not be practical to do in a small cage setting, but I illustrate it just to show you that there are oftentimes very simple forms of intervention that can actually help to manage these sorts of behaviors. Next slide, Christina. Okay, other considerations if you're looking at conspecific housing, what's the group size? Is there an optimal group size? And how do you figure that as a function of this allocated space, the design of the pen, and the purpose of the research? Okay, so these things must be considered. Another factor that we know is important is the social compatibility of the animals that are housed together. We know that pigs form preferential social associations with each other, and thus, once you keep that in mind, housing them in social groups in which they're incompatible can actually do more harm than if they're housed individually, but, for instance, in a room where they can actually see and hear each other. Okay? Therefore, it's important, if possible, to purchase pigs in groups so that they're maintaining that familiarity, because we already talked about familiarity being a potential factor in the effectiveness of their ability to buffer stress in each other. And also maintaining groups that are socially compatible. Next slide. Experience of the pigs and their temperament is absolutely going to be a key factor as well. Okay? So we know that the efficacy of social support is impacted by the experience that the companion animal, who let's say is not necessarily the subject of the research, but is providing that social support, that animal's previous experience and also their temperament can influence the usefulness as a form of social support for the subject animal. Next bullet point. The emotional state of that companion absolutely has been demonstrated to be able to either provide or undermine the quality of social support provided. Next bullet point. And in several studies we've had, and I'll give you a couple more of these after this point, what we've seen is that if you have a stressor that is present, the companion animal that is non-fearful, in part because it has not experienced that stressor, is actually able to provide an effect that shows reduced fear responses in the test subject, more so than if that companion is fearful, especially because it's experienced that same stressor. Next slide. Okay, first bullet point. In a study that was done in 2004, animals that were conspecifics or companions that were not shocked, this was the stressor that was being tested, were more effective buffers than companion animals that also received shock at reducing stress-induced hyperthermia and behavioral indicators of fear, and also brain changes, thought expression in the PVN in response to actually experiencing electric shock. Next bullet point. We also know that stress-familiar partners in pigs can buffer each other's responses, but if the animal that is providing that social support is unfamiliar, they do a poorer job of providing adequate support, and in some instances may actually exacerbate the stress experienced by the subject animal. Next bullet point. And then an important point to keep in mind is that we absolutely do have strains of pigs that are stress susceptible, and we certainly have breeds, including some lines of mini pigs, that have a higher tendency to be very quickly and highly aroused or reactive, and have a lower threshold for aggressive behavior to occur. So one of the things to think about is the experience of the companion, the temperament of the individuals, and the breed of the animal should be considerations for compatibility. Next slide. When we are looking at specific animals in terms of social housing, boars are sometimes used for research purposes. Their management has to be considered separately and different from animals at other stages. Because we know that in the wild, boars tend to be solitary, it is theoretically possible that they may tolerate individual housing or solitary housing better than other pigs. Okay? Competition for resources in boars, especially as a function of their age, is likely to result in serious fights, and more serious so as the animals progress through age if they're group housed. And one of the things that we know, and I can attest to this personally having worked with micro pigs and mini pigs as well as farm pigs, is that this can occur even when those animals have been housed harmoniously when they're younger. Okay? So this is a factor both of age, practice at fighting behavior, and hormonal support for the behavior as these animals mature. So absolutely, again, the breed of the pig and the genetic line has to be considered in boar management in particular. Next bullet point. Because some lines of mini pigs really do tend to show low thresholds for aggression, and some of them are tusked. If their tusks are not being clipped or trimmed, if the tusks are present, the risk if these animals get into fights is absolutely compounded, and so one of the things we must think about is how to protect them. So there are instances where the physical risk to the animals, particularly in this regard, may lead one to housing them individually, and one of the things we'll talk about is how to support those animals in those circumstances. Next slide. Some of the other risks, in addition to aggression, that we have to think about, and again, this ties very nicely back to the dog talk that preceded mine, is that particularly in some breeds of pigs, in the mini pigs, sexually mature boars will mount each other, okay? And they don't do this just as a function of sexual behavior. Hierarchical rank does come into play here. So what we know is that monitoring of these animals is really important because it's the low-ranking pigs that tend to be repeatedly mounted. This can, of course, lead into a chronic stress scenario, and depending on what else is happening, the animals can get injured as a result of this behavior. And so the intervention that's appropriate here is actually to remove the lowest-ranking animals if the behavior is persistent. Now, if singly housed, boars, but this applies to all pigs, really should be kept in visual, olfactory, and potentially protected tactile contact with companions. Next slide. When isolation is necessary, caretaker interactions absolutely become much more important, okay? The quality and the quantity of the interactions the animals are having with people matter. One of the things that we know is that pigs are able to recognize, distinguish between, and respond to familiar caretakers accordingly. And so what we don't want to have happen is have some caretakers handling the animals roughly or inconsistently. Positive social contact and behaviors such as talking to the animals, stroking them, petting them, and so on, and providing low-stress handling when handling is necessary is critical here. What's just as important, if not more so, is avoiding aversive handling, and what's even worse than that is inconsistent handling when the animals have no ability to predict how they're going to be handled. We know that a chronic stress response tends to get activated because the animals simply cannot adapt to what is happening to them, and they can't predict it. Next slide. Now, adding caretaker interaction, and what we do in our labs oftentimes involves training pigs to facilitate our procedures, can definitely add to management time, but a lot of benefits come out of this sort of intervention. Depending on what you do, as in, for instance, we do in our lab, the pigs actually help us to collect their data. In previous studies that we've done, we've actually been able to train pigs to present for blood draws, or at least to hold still for blood draws so that we don't have to snare them to do that. Depending on what you're measuring, we absolutely do not want handling stress to compound anything else that we're looking at, and so that becomes a very helpful tool. The rigor, therefore, and the quality of the data, it can be supported through positive human-animal interactions. One of the other factors that oftentimes isn't taken into consideration is this can impact caretaker affect and attitude about interacting with those animals. That actually feeds back to the animals themselves. So we get this nice feedback loop where caretakers who are having positive interactions with the animals enjoy what they're doing more, interact with the animals more appropriately, and as a result, the animals give us more desirable behaviors than undesirable behaviors as a result. So overall, doing this kind of thing can prove to be practical as well as cost-effective. Next slide. Okay, so last thing I'll talk to you about is conspecific housing alternatives. Are there viable options to conspecific housing? We certainly could think about housing with other species that are appropriate companions. Certainly wouldn't want to put a predator species in with a farm animal or food animal species like a pig. This is really uncommon, though, although it has been seen in some of the medical research facilities I've worked in where pigs are being used as research subjects and they are isolated. Oftentimes across the hallways there may be other farm animal species. Sheep are pretty common, who are also being singly housed for the research purposes. The benefit of that sort of interspecific social support is really not well studied. So I'm not going to spend any time on that. Passive or inanimate forms of enrichment obviously can be options. Many people have looked at the use of TVs, video recordings, and the use of mirrors. I've got a picture here showing a pig interacting with a mirrored surface. We'll look at whether or not this is useful. Next slide. Mirrors clearly are oftentimes used for enrichment purposes. We know that they'll allow primates, for instance, to view their reflections or better see activities that are taking place outside their pens. There's some evidence that they can help attenuate stress responses in isolated sheep, but may only be partially effective as a substitute for another animal because in isolation there are a number of factors that are going to contribute to distress. So the thought process is they may primarily provide visual support for the animals, or visual stimuli. Next slide. The question is, do mirrors provide social or useful social support for pigs? Next bullet point. The data here doesn't give us clear answers because there are actually very few studies on this topic. Next point. Clearly the mirror has no ability to provide auditory, maybe minimally tactile support, so it may be useful as a form of enrichment in other ways. Next bullet point. Pigs have been shown to use mirrors to obtain information about the environment or to locate, for instance, hidden food, as in Don Broom's study of 2009. Studies done by Ray Strickland, for instance, so in the early 2000s, showed similar patterns or similar trends. Next bullet point. Now, one thing that we have to think about is how cognitive ability comes into play here. If pigs are able to recognize themselves, the mirror as a form of social support now diminishes in terms of its usefulness. Okay? Next bullet point. However, there is limited evidence that pigs do recognize themselves when they look at mirrors. So it may be that they are actually somewhat useful in that regard. Next bullet point. Next slide. In a study that was done here at Purdue, that was published last year, one of our very talented graduate students, who I'm fortunate to work with, looked at enrichment preferences for several different substrates. Her enrichments were a companion animal, which you see in the darkest bars, having access to a rubber mat, having access to a pen with a mirrored surface, and a control area which was simply another open pen. And she used 14 animals that had continuous access to these resources. Next slide. And what she found is that if you looked at the social enrichment, so here we're really focusing on the provision of a companion or that mirrored surface as a potential form of social enrichment, if you looked at the probability of choosing social enrichment when there was a human in the room, what we see is the likelihood goes up that they're going to choose one of these enrichments when a human is present, period. Next slide. What we also see is that when you look at the probability of choosing a mirror over a conspecific, the probability goes up that they'll choose the mirror at all when a human, or they're more likely to do this when a human is present in the room than when the human is absent in the room. Okay? And Christine, I'm going to ask you to go backwards just a little bit, 2 slides over to the first enrichment preference slide.
Okay.
And if you look at all of the 4 enrichments, you'll see that overall the pigs, when given a choice, prefer the companion or access to a companion over any of the other form of enrichments. Mirror choice here is very low relative to having access to a companion or having access to a pen where there's a rubber mat that they can lie on for comfort. Okay, Christina, we'll go back, we'll go forward, to the slide that we ended on, which is the difference between the mirror and a conspecific when a human is present.
Okay.
And so you'll clearly see that use of the mirror, even though it's much less than choice of a conspecific, goes up in regard to the presence of a human. Okay? So one of the things that tells us is that when they perceive some sort of threat, pigs actually are going to the mirror potentially as a form of social support, but really we're not entirely sure what's happening here. Okay, next slide. I would like to acknowledge my colleague and graduate student, Shelley DeBoer, for providing her research and her original data for the presence of this talk. And very quickly to wrap up, I'm going to just point out what some of the take-home messages are. Social housing is clearly an important component of pig welfare in laboratory settings. It is absolutely supported by the ethology of the pig, the cognitive studies that exist, and the physiological data we have when these animals are socially isolated. For optimal results, we want to consider the compatibility of animals. And as compatibility factors go, we want to take into consideration the previous experience of companion animals, the familiarity of those animals, the temperament, age, and breed of the individuals that we're working with. Proper management in social housing has to consider appropriate space, appropriate pen design, and resource allocation. And finally, further study of the usefulness of inanimate forms of social support, such as mirrors, absolutely is needed. So with that, I will take questions.
All right, thank you, Candace.